All right, let's go. Number 10. The Paleo Valley under the English Channel. In 2007, Sanjeev Gupta and Jenny Collier of Imperial College London published a map of the floor of the English Channel in the journal Nature. It was built from high-resolution sonar. It is not a chart for sailors. It shows the shape of the bedrock under the water, and the shape is wrong. There is a valley down there. It runs about 100 kilometers in a straight line, cut as much as 50 meters into solid rock. The floor is less than 15 kilometers wide. In cross-section, it is close to rectangular, with walls that rise at about 2 degrees. Inside it, a narrower inner channel runs 40 meters deeper still. Rivers do not do that. Rivers meander. They cut V-shaped valleys. They leave floodplains. And they take hundreds of thousands of years about it. The rest of the map is worse. Sitting on the valley floor are streamlined islands of bedrock, up to 10 kilometers long and 4 wide, shaped like teardrops with the points facing southwest. Running between them are grooves scoured into the rock, roughly 200 meters wide and 10 to 15 kilometers long. Every one of those landforms belongs to a single family. They are what happens when an enormous volume of water moves in one direction, fast, and does not stop. Gupta and his colleagues worked the discharge backwards from the size of the landforms. The number was around 1 million cubic meters per second. That is a modeled figure, not a measurement, and it should be read as an order of magnitude. For scale, the Amazon delivers roughly 200,000. But here's where the map stops describing a valley and starts describing a wall. Britain used to be part of Europe, not by a land bridge in the loose sense, but structurally, joined by a ridge of chalk running from the Weald in Kent across to the Artois in northern France. That ridge was the northern limb of a long fold in the rock, with a gentle slope on its northern side and a steep escarpment facing southwest. Behind it, in what is now the southern North Sea, a glacial lake sat against the ice. In 2017, the same team published the second half of the story in Nature Communications. Sub-bottom surveys in the Dover Strait found 7 enormous depressions buried under sediment in a belt about 7 kilometers wide between Dover and Calais. They are the Fosses d'Angard. The deepest is cut 140 meters into Cretaceous bedrock. Engineers had noticed them in the 1960s while surveying for a channel tunnel. In 1985, the geologist Alex Smith suggested what they were. Plunge pools. Water going over an edge, landing hard, and drilling holes in the floor. Cutting straight across those filled-in holes is another feature. The Loborg Channel, 80 kilometers long and box-shaped, with more streamlined islands and more scour. It postdates the plunge pools. So there were 2 events, not one. First a spillover that ate backwards into the ridge, then a breach. The chronology is the weakest part of the whole thing, and the authors say so themselves. There is no direct date from the Dover Strait. The proposed ages, around 450,000 years for the first stage and something like 160,000 for the second, come from correlation with glacial stages elsewhere, and the paper itself calls the second of them plausible rather than established. Drilling the sediment inside the fosses is the test that would settle it. What is not in doubt is that the ridge is gone and the water is there. Humans were living in Britain 950,000 years ago at Happisburgh on the Norfolk coast. They were at Boxgrove 500,000 years ago. The record then goes quiet from around 180,000 years ago until around 60,000. That is a gap of roughly 120,000 years, which is an extraordinary length of time for an empty country in the middle of an occupied continent. Nobody had to leave. The land they walked in on stopped existing. Britain is an island because a chalk ridge failed. Number 9. The engraved block from Abauntz cave. A flat block of stone came out of the 1993 excavation season at a cave called Abauntz in Navarre, in northern Spain. It is small enough to fit in a hand. Both faces are covered in engraved lines cut with a stone point, overlapping each other the way Paleolithic engravings usually do, so that the surface looks at first like scribble. It took about 15 years to publish. In 2009, Pilar Utrilla of the University of Zaragoza and 4 colleagues described it in the Journal of Human Evolution, and the layer it came from is late Magdalenian, dated to around 13,000, 660 years ago in calibrated radiocarbon years. What they argue is, on it is a landscape. Across the upper part of one face runs a line that meanders the way a river meanders, with tributaries joining it near a set of raised forms the excavators read as mountains. There are ponds. On the slopes there are ibex, drawn as a herd rather than as trophy animals. There are lines the authors suggest are routes, ways of moving from one part of the ground to another. Their reading is that this is either a sketch of the country around the cave, or the record of a hunt, one that had already happened, or one that was being planned. Either way, it is a piece of terrain, held in the hand, made by somebody who is standing on it. That would make it unusual. Portable art from the Magdalenian is abundant, and most of it is animals. Horses, bison, deer, cut into bone and antler and stone with real skill. A block that records space rather than a creature is a different kind of object, and it implies a different kind of thinking about the world. The problem is that nothing on it can be checked. There is no scale. There is no north. There is no legend, and not a single label. A map of a real place should in principle be testable against the place, and the excavators say the engraved forms match the ground around the cave. But a valley with a river in it and hills on either side is not a fingerprint. There are a great many of them, too many to test. This remains an interpretation offered by the people who dug it up. It should be described that way, and not as a settled fact. The excavators have argued the case in detail, and no specialist has published a case against it, which is not the same thing as agreement. What is not interpretation is the date, and the date is the interesting part. 13,660 years ago falls a few centuries after the single largest surge of meltwater in the entire deglaciation, and the ocean at that moment was still tens of meters below where it is now. It was also climbing fast. Whoever cut those lines was living through the most rapid change in world geography our species has experienced. None of that is on the stone, and the coast is not drawn. Whether they had ever seen it, whether it was 3 days walk away or 30, whether the older people in that cave talked about ground that had gone under, there is no way to know. We have the map. We do not have the map maker, the purpose, or the key. And the shoreline of the world that block was made in is now somewhere out in the Bay of Biscay, underwater, unmapped by anybody at all. Number 8. Doggerland. The trawler Kalinda was working the Lehman and Ower banks in the southern North Sea in 1931 off the Norfolk coast, and her net came up loaded with peat. Inside one of the lumps was a point of antler about 22 centimeters long, worked down to a shaft and cut with a single row of barbs. The skipper, Pilgrim Lockwood, kept it. It is in the Norwich Castle Museum now. Peat does not form on a seabed. Peat forms in a bog, in the open air, on land. The point was radiocarbon, dated at Oxford, at 11,740 years before present. Give or take 150, uncalibrated. That places it in the late glacial, several thousand years older than the Mesolithic label still attached to it in popular accounts. Somebody made that weapon while the North Sea was a country. In 1998, Bryony Coles of the University of Exeter published a paper in the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society giving the country a name. She called it Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank. Her argument was that the standard phrase, land bridge, framed the place as a corridor between two real countries rather than as somewhere people lived. She drew maps. She also titled the paper a speculative survey and warned in it that the shape of the modern seabed is unreliable evidence for the shape of the old land. What makes Doggerland different from every other drowned country on this list is that somebody then went and mapped it properly. Between 2003 and 2007, Vincent Gaffney and Ken Thompson at the University of Birmingham ran a project using three-dimensional seismic reflection data donated by the survey company Petroleum Geo Services. This is data collected to find oil. It images the layers under the seabed and red at the right horizon. It returns the ground surface as it was before the sea arrived. They mapped more than 23,000 square kilometers of it, drawn from more than 60 separate surveys belonging to 20 different owners. A landscape came up out of the noise. There is a major river, named the Schotten after the geologist Frederick Schotten, draining the Dogger Bank. There are lakes sitting in hollows created by salt moving deep underground. There is the Outer Silver Pit, a great inlet south of the bank. Coastlines were reconstructed at 4 separate dates, and they move. Then, the same approach was taken to a far larger area. Europe's Lost Frontiers, run from the University of Bradford on a European Research Council grant between 2015 and 2021, mapped around 185,000 square kilometers of early Holocene landscape. It also took sedimentary ancient DNA from 40 cores at 33 sites, which is how a plant list gets assembled for a country that nobody has ever seen. The unsettling part is what one of those cores recorded. 8,150 years ago, a piece of the continental slope off mid-Norway collapsed. The Storegga slide moved something on the order of 1.5 to 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment, a figure revised downward recently. It generated a tsunami. In Shetland, the run-up exceeded 20 meters. Core ELF 001A was taken from a drowned river channel in the southern North Sea, about 42 kilometers inland from the coast of the day. In it is a layer of sand 45 centimeters thick, containing 6 separate upward-finding sequences, freshly broken shells, marine microfossils mixed with land pollen, and wood. The DNA in that layer changes abruptly. Below it, the sediment is estuarine plants and meadow. Inside it, there is a sudden flood of oak, hazel, and birch. That is a forest arriving somewhere. A forest was not. The centimeters above the sand show the landscape coming back. That is the finding the team published in 2020, and it cuts against the story most people have heard. Storegga did not sink Doggerland. The meadow plants return. What finally took the place was the sea itself. Later, slowly, with no event to blame. The human remains are the part that stays. In 2001, a shell dredger working the Zeeland ridges off the Dutch coast brought up sediment containing a piece of skull recovered from the spoil by a collector named Luc Antonis, and Jean-Jacques Hublin and colleagues published it in 2009. It is the right side of the frontal bone of an adult male Neanderthal. The stable isotopes in it show a diet with no significant marine protein at all, from a man whose remains came out of the sea. Late glacial human bone has surfaced the same way, along with a decorated piece of bovid bone, and mammoth, and lion. There is no cemetery to excavate and no settlement to plan. There is an antler point in a case in Norwich. There is a fragment of forehead in a museum in Leiden. There is a flint with birch bark tar still on it, dredged up 40 kilometers off Cromer. Everything else those people owned is spread across the floor of the North Sea in no order at all. Number 7. The river beneath the South China Sea. In 1921, a Dutch geologist named Gustav Adolf Frederick Molengraaf published a paper in the Geographical Journal on deep sea research in the East Indian archipelago. He was working from ship soundings. In the 1920s, that meant a weighted line over the side, thousands of times, plotted onto a chart. What emerged from the dots was a system of valleys running across the seabed between Sumatra, Borneo, and Java. They were river valleys. He said so. The Sunda shelf is the reason he could see them. It is one of the largest continental shelves on Earth, up to 800 kilometers across, and it is shallow in a way that is hard to picture. Water depth over most of it rarely passes 50 meters, and enormous areas are under 20. It is not a slope. It is a floor. The main system now carries his name. The North Sunda River, or Molengraaf River, rose between Belitung and Borneo, ran northeast, collected the drainage of central Sumatra and of western and northern Borneo, and emptied into the South China Sea. A second system drained northern Java and southern Borneo eastward, into what is now the Java Sea. But here's where the shape of that shelf turns a piece of geology into a problem about people. On a flat surface, vertical sea level change converts into horizontal shoreline movement at a punishing rate. A rise of 1 meter on a gradient of 1 in 1,000 moves the coast a kilometer inland. Between about 14,600 and 14,300 years ago, global sea level rose by something in the range of 14 to 18 meters. That happened over roughly 3 centuries. What does that look like to somebody living on it? Not a wave, not a wall of water. It looks like the fishing camp their grandmother used being underwater, and the creek turning brackish, and the good ground being somewhere else now. Every generation. For 300 years. The valleys have been confirmed repeatedly since Mollengraf drew them. The Naga expedition of 1959 to 1961 produced echo sounder profiles across them. The Sun cruise of 1996 ran more than 8,000 line kilometers of shallow seismic and returned clean cross-sections. Channels incised up to 25 meters, with infills reaching 50. In 2000, Harold Voris of the Field Museum in Chicago published maps of the whole region at 8 different sea level contours in the Journal of Biogeography, and the drowned river systems appear on the deeper ones. Satyamurthy and Voris followed in 2006 with a Holocene sequence and identified probable freshwater lakes sitting on the drowned surface. The area involved is around 2 million square kilometers, roughly the size of India, although the exact figure is genuinely unsettled and different papers are measuring slightly different things. A landmass that size drowning invites a particular kind of claim, and it has attracted one. Stephen Oppenheimer argued in 1998 that Sundaland held a sophisticated Neolithic society, whose destruction scattered survivors westward, seeding agriculture and flood stories across Eurasia. The geology underneath that claim is completely sound. The civilization is not. No submerged Sundaland site has produced anything of the kind. The genetic and linguistic evidence for Austronesian origins points in the other direction, towards Taiwan. It sits as a minority view among archaeologists, linguists, and geneticists, and that is where it should be left. What actually drowned is interesting enough without it. 2 million square kilometers of low, wet, river-fed land in the tropics, which is precisely the country people prefer, occupied for tens of thousands of years and taken in stages. Nothing about the drowning is in dispute. The shelf went under, the rivers are mapped, and the dates are solid. What has never been produced is a single site. The channels are still down there. Sonar finds them every time anybody looks. Not one settlement, not one burial, and not one hearth has ever been recovered from them. Number 6. The Gulf that was a valley. The Persian Gulf is barely a sea. It covers about 251,000 square kilometers. Its average depth is around 50 meters. Its deepest point is about 90. The Strait of Hormuz, the only opening, is 56 kilometers across at its narrowest, and everything behind it is warm, shallow, half-enclosed water. Now put the last glacial maximum against those numbers. Between 29 and 21,000 years ago, the ocean stood about 134 meters below where it stands today. A basin whose floor lies 50 meters down cannot hold water under that condition. It cannot even hold a lake. In 1996, Kurt Lambeck published shoreline reconstructions for the Persian Gulf since the last glacial maximum in Earth and Planetary Science Letters. The work is not a guess at where the beach was, but a model of the sea surface and the land surface together through time, because the crust itself flexes as ice and water are shifted around on top of it. The result is a basin that was dry ground, from Kuwait to Hormuz, for tens of thousands of years. The Tigris and the Euphrates, already joined, ran the length of it. The Karun came in from the east. The whole drainage carried on through the strait and emptied into the Gulf of Oman. So the map is a valley, a long one, with one of the largest rivers in Western Asia running down the middle, except a dry basin is not automatically an empty one. In 2010, Jeffrey Rose published an argument in Current Anthropology that this particular basin was the best land in the region. Arabia at the time was arid. The basin floor was low, sheltered, sunk below the level of the deserts on either side, and watered year-round by rivers rising in the mountains hundreds of kilometers away. He called it the Arabo-Persian Gulf Oasis, and his proposal is that it was occupied, possibly for a very long time, by people whose entire archaeological record now lies under the sea. Then, the ice melted, and the water came back through Hormuz. The basin filled. The Gulf on a modern map is a young feature, and its present coastline is younger still. The evidence Rose leans on is not from the basin. It is from the rim. In the millennia after the flooding, settlements appear along the Arabian shore of the Gulf, and they appear with a suddenness that is hard to explain by local development. They carry pottery made in Mesopotamia. His reading is that these are displaced people, arriving on a new coast because the old one no longer existed. That is a hypothesis, and it is worth being precise about its status. Nothing has been excavated from the floor of the Persian Gulf. Not a hearth, not a flake, not a bone. Every part of the argument is built from bathymetry, from sea level curves, and from the distribution of sites on the modern shore. Absence of evidence in a basin nobody has surveyed is not evidence of absence. It is also not evidence of anything else. The oasis is a reading of a landscape rather than a report on one, and it is the kind of claim that can only be settled by going and looking. What is haunting about this one is how testable it is, and how untested it has been left. The North Sea has been imaged across 185,000 square kilometers, and only because oil companies had already paid for the data. Nothing equivalent has ever been run here. The floor of the Gulf lies 50 meters down in quiet, warm, shallow water over an area about the size of the United Kingdom. Either there is a long human record sitting on it, or there is nothing at all. Those are the only two options. Both of them have been down there, undisturbed, the entire time the argument has been going on. Number 5. The Piri Reis map of 1513. In 1929, the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul was being converted into a museum, and Halil Edhem Eldem, the director of the National Museums, was working through what was in the building. He gave the German theologian Gustav Adolf Deissmann access to the non-Islamic material in the library. In a bundle of parchment, they found a chart. The Orientalist Paul Cayley identified whose it was. It is drawn on gazelle skin. The surviving piece measures about 87 by 63 centimeters, roughly a third of the original sheet. It is signed in the month of Muharram in the year 919 of the Hijri calendar, which is 1513. The mapmaker was Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral who had sailed with his uncle Kemal Reis in the corsair fleets of the eastern Mediterranean. He presented it to Sultan Selim I in 1517 in Cairo, after the Ottoman conquest of Egypt. Then it disappears from the record for 412 years. What survives shows the Atlantic. Iberia and the west coast of Africa run down the right-hand side. The coast of Brazil runs down the left. The Caribbean is at the top left, arranged in a way that matches no modern map and no other chart of the period. There is a large island oriented vertically, labeled Hispaniola. There is a western coastline that merges Cuba into the Central American mainland as a single landmass. That is not an error. That is Columbus's own view of what he had found, preserved on parchment. Piri Reis wrote his sources into the margins. He lists about 20 charts and world maps, among them maps derived from Ptolemy, an Arabic map of India, 4 recent Portuguese charts of Asia, and a map by Columbus of the West Indies. And the internal evidence supports him. There is a place name on the Cuban coast, Ornife, that survives on no other map. There is an island rendered in Turkish letters with a name Columbus gave on his second voyage in August of 1494. What makes the Piri Reis map the most argued over document in the history of cartography is a coastline at the bottom of it. Below Brazil, the land turns and runs east and keeps running. In the 1950s, the engineer Arlington Mallory proposed that this was Antarctica. Charles Hapgood and his students took the idea further and made it famous. Their claim was that the map shows the coast of Queen Maud Land as it looked before the ice, and that somebody had surveyed it. Supporters pointed to a seismic survey of Queen Maud Land carried out by a Norwegian, British, and Swedish expedition in 1949. It produced a picture of the bedrock underneath the ice sheet. Set the two shapes side by side, and there is a resemblance. The resemblance is real. It is also meaningless. So what would have to be true for that to work? Ice would have to be young. Hapgood believed it was, and wrote that Antarctica had been free of ice as recently as 4,000 years before Christ. That is the load-bearing error in the whole structure, and it is not a small one. Continental ice has been sitting on East Antarctica for something on the order of 34 million years. There was no coast. That is long before there was anything on this planet that could hold a pin. The second problem is that a map of rock under an ice sheet is not a coastline. It is a picture of a surface currently buried under kilometers of ice and pressed down by the weight of it. Remove the ice and the crust rises over thousands of years, and the shape changes as it goes. The two things being compared are not the same kind of object. The third problem is the map itself. Gregory McIntosh, who published the most detailed study of it in 2000, worked south along the drawn coast to find the last thing that can be securely identified. It is Cabo Frio, written on the parchment as Cave Frio, near modern Rio de Janeiro, probably Canania below it. Past that point, there is no textual or historical evidence that the coast corresponds to any real place. A southern landmass along the bottom edge was a standing convention of the period, Terra Australis, drawn by cartographers who had never been near it. McIntosh also took apart the claim that this is the most accurate map of the 16th century, listing several later maps that are plainly better. Here is the reversal, and it is worth sitting with. Strip the Antarctic coastline out of the argument, and you are left with something extraordinary. An Ottoman admiral, 21 years after the first crossing, working in a Mediterranean port, assembled charts from 3 separate cartographic traditions onto a single skin, and one of them was drawn by Columbus himself, of which no other copy survives anywhere on Earth. That map is a record of how fast information moved in 1513. The real achievement got buried under an argument about a coast that isn't there. Number 4. The drowned shore of the Black Sea. William Ryan and Walter Pittman of the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University, with 8 colleagues from Russia, Bulgaria, and Turkey, published 6 pages in the journal Marine Geology in 1997. The abstract makes a claim you can test. During the last glaciation, they wrote, the Black Sea became a giant freshwater lake, and its surface drew down to more than 100 meters below its outlet. When the rising Mediterranean reached the Bosphorus sill, salt water poured through and refilled it, drowning more than 100,000 square kilometers of exposed shelf. The evidence starts with the shelf itself. Ryan's later synthesis lists what is preserved on it at specific depths, and read in order it is a drowned country. Roots at 123 meters, a wave-cut terrace at 120. Algal deposits at 110, mud cracks at 99, the crests of barrier islands at 95. The bedrock sill at the Bosphorus sits at 70 meters, and everything below that line was air. Then the shells. In the mud beneath the flooding surface are freshwater mussels, Dreissena, dated across thousands of years. Above it are marine species. The critical measurement is what happens when the first marine colonizer is sampled at 5 separate sites, spread from 123 meters depth up to 49. All 5 return the same radiocarbon age, 7,140 years, give or take 40. The deepest and the shallowest were colonized within about 4 decades of each other, 40 years. That is what abrupt looks like in a sediment core. In 1999, Robert Ballard ran a survey off Sinop on the Turkish coast with side-scan sonar, a remotely operated vehicle, and a dredge. He reported an eroded shoreline at 155 meters. Mollusks dated the marine flooding at that spot to between 7,460 and 6,820 years before present. His team also found a long, linear feature at around the 100-meter contour, which got a great deal of press. The people on the expedition were considerably more careful about it than the coverage was, and no peer-reviewed identification of it as a structure was ever published. And then the people who went looking for the flood started finding the opposite. In 2002, Ali Aksu of Memorial University of Newfoundland and colleagues published in GSA Today the results of about 7,500 line kilometers of seismic profiling, 65 cores, and 43 radiocarbon dates. The material came from the Marmara Sea and the northern Aegean on the far side of the strait. What they found was 10 to 11,000 years of persistently low salinity surface water. Low salinity there means fresh water coming out of the Black Sea, not seawater going in. The flow was outward. Their own sentence is the cleanest statement of the objection. There is no interruption in the degree of stratification at about 7,500 years, as would surely have accompanied a catastrophic flood. In 2009, Liviu Giosin of Woods Hole, with Florin Philippe and Stefan Constantinescu of the University of Bucharest, attacked it from the Danube Delta instead. They used paired mollusks still articulated in place, meaning the animals died where they lived, and those put the Black Sea's level before reconnection at about 30 meters below present, rather than 80 or lower. On those numbers, the rise is 5 to 10 meters, not 50 to 60, and the flooded area is around 2,000 square kilometers, rather than 100,000. Ryan then revised his own date. By 2003, he was putting the connection at 8,400 years ago. An independent redating in 2011 moved it to around 9,000. He never withdrew the flood itself. His position stayed that the hypothesis, although challenged, still best fits the full set of observations. The disturbing thing about this entry is not the water. It is watching a scientific claim turn into a cultural one. The 1997 paper does not mention Noah. It does not mention Gilgamesh. Its only cultural sentence suggests the drowning may have accelerated the movement of early farmers into Europe. The flood of Noah framing, and the comparison of the inflow to 200 Niagaras come from the trade book Ryan and Pittman, published in 1998, and from the press coverage around it. Those flow figures have never appeared in the peer-reviewed literature. The archaeological problem with the connection is arithmetic. The event dates somewhere between 7,500 and 9,000 years ago. The earliest written flood narratives are from the second millennium before Christ. Ronald Hindle, who works on the Hebrew Bible at Berkeley, has pointed out that anyone hunting the flood behind Noah should be looking in northern Mesopotamia, and that the biblical account descends from earlier Mesopotamian literature rather than from a remembered event. The Bosphorus is still the only door, and it is still only 40 meters deep at the sill. Below 200 meters, the Black Sea has no oxygen in it at all, which is why in the year 2000, a wooden ship from the 5th or 6th century was found at 320 meters, with its mast still standing upright into the water. Whatever the sea did to that shelf, it is holding on to the evidence. Nobody has yet made it give a straight answer. Number 3. Beringia. Every atlas draws it the same way. A gray band bridging Siberia and Alaska, an arrow pointing east across it, and a date underneath. It is one of the most reproduced maps in education, and almost every element of it has moved in the last 5 years. Start with the strait itself, 82 kilometers wide at its narrowest, between Cape Dezhnev in Chukotka and Cape Prince of Wales in Alaska. The sill is 53 meters deep. At the glacial maximum, the ocean stood about 130 meters lower, so the strait was not a strait at all. And Beringia, at its widest, ran up to 1,000 kilometers from north to south. That much is straightforward. The date is not. In December 2022, Jesse Farmer of Princeton and colleagues published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, built on nitrogen isotopes preserved in the shells of microscopic organisms taken from Arctic Ocean sediment cores. The reasoning is indirect and clean. Pacific water carries a distinctive nutrient signature, and it can only reach the Arctic through the Bering Strait. If the signature is present, the strait is open water. If it vanishes, the strait is land. The signature is present from the beginning of their record, 46,000 years ago, and it stops at 35,700. The land bridge did not exist until then. The textbook figure had been closer to 70,000 years. Their own conclusion states it plainly. The result shortens the time window between the opening of the land bridge and the arrival of humans in the Americas. The other end moved too. Tamara Pico, Jerry Mitrovica, and Alan Mix published in Science Advances in 2020 using sea level fingerprinting, which accounts for the fact that melting ice sheets do not raise the sea evenly across the globe. Their model gives a first breach of the sill by about 13,000 years ago, and total inundation about 11,500 years ago. So the corridor was open for roughly 24,000 years, not 50, and into that shortened window falls White Sands. In 2021, Matthew Bennett and colleagues published human footprints from a dry lake bed in New Mexico in the journal Science, stratigraphically bracketed by seed layers dating between about 23 and 21,000 years ago. The result was contested immediately on the reasonable grounds that aquatic seeds can take up old carbon. So it was tested again. In 2023, the team dated terrestrial pollen from the same layers and independently dated quartz grains by optically stimulated luminescence. In 2025, a separate group dated the lake mud. 3 different materials, 3 different methods, 2 research groups, and now over 50 consistent radiocarbon dates. There were people in New Mexico during the glacial maximum, when the ice sheets were at their largest and the routes south were at their worst. The last thing to go is the landscape itself. The illustrations always show dry grassland, mammoths, a horizon like the Serengeti in winter. Scott Elias and colleagues published paleobotanical and fossil beetle data from the central and northern land bridge in Nature in 1996, and what those samples describe is mesic shrub tundra, damp ground, low scrub. Their finding was explicit, that there was no evidence of steppe tundra on the land bridge at all. Elias later argued the bridge may have worked as a moisture barrier, an obstacle to dry-adapted animals, rather than a road for them. That matters for the picture on every illustration. A wet, low, shrubby plain is not a highway for grazing herds, and it is not the open ground the arrow on the map implies. So the haunting version of this map is not the one on the classroom wall. It is a cold, wet lowland, open for a shorter time than anyone taught, crossed by people whose descendants were thousands of kilometers to the south before the ice had finished growing. Nothing they left behind is recoverable. Every camp, every hearth, every set of footprints between Chukotka and Alaska lies under 53 meters of some of the roughest water on the planet. The 2 Diomede Islands still stand out in the middle of the strait, 3.8 kilometers apart. They are the highest ground of a country that is otherwise entirely seabed. Number 2, the maps that were never drawn. In 2020, Jonathan Benjamin of Flinders University published, with a team including Peter Jeffries of the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation, the first confirmed underwater Aboriginal archaeological sites in Australia. The paper is in Palal 1, 2 locations, both off the Murujuga coastline in the northwest. At Cape Bruguiere Channel, there are more than 260 stone artifacts lying on the seabed, down to 2.4 meters below sea level. Most are made on a local volcanic rock. At Flying Foam Passage, there is a single artifact at 14 meters, beside a submerged freshwater spring, which is exactly where people would have stopped. The dates are limits rather than measurements. The artifacts cannot be younger than about 7,000 years at the first site, and 8,500 at the second, because that is when the sea closed over the ground they sit on. They are at least that old. Nobody knows how much older. 2 sites. That is what exists for the whole drowned edge of a continent. The size of what is missing was quantified in 2018 by Alan Williams and colleagues in Quaternary Science Reviews. At the glacial maximum, the Australian landmass covered 9.8 million square kilometers. 2.12 million of them, about 22%, were gone by 8,000 years ago. Roughly 90% of that loss happened after 14,500 years ago. In some places, the shoreline retreated at up to 23.7 meters a year, which is about 600 meters of country inside a 25-year generation. In 2024, Cassie Norman of Griffith University and colleagues published a study of one piece of it. The Northwest Shelf covered around 400,000 square kilometers, half again the size of New Zealand. Their reconstruction gives it an archipelago phase lasting some 9,000 years, and a landlocked inland sea, the Melita Sea, covering more than 18,000 square kilometers. They then ran an Earth system model of productivity across that landscape and converted it into a carrying capacity. The range they report is 50,000 to 500,000 people at various times. That is a model of what the country could have supported, not a count of anyone. Nobody was counted. It is worth saying clearly, but it describes a habitable region, occupied for tens of thousands of years, and it describes what happened to it. More than 100,000 square kilometers drowned in 400 years during the Great Meltwater Pulse. Another 100,000 went in the 3,000 years after 12,000 years ago. About half the shelf in 2 strokes. The truly unsettling part is that the people who lost that country appear to have kept a record of it. In 2016, Patrick Nunn of the University of the Sunshine Coast and Nicholas Reed of the University of New England published a study in Australian Geographer. They examined 21 locations around the Australian coast where Aboriginal traditions describe the sea covering land that is now seabed. Their method is straightforward. For each story, work out the minimum depth of water required for the described detail to have been literally true. Then look up when the sea was last at that depth using an established sea level curve for Australia. The stories bracket, overwhelmingly, between about 7,000 to 213,000 years ago. The details are specific. The Narungga described Spencer Gulf as marshy country, with a line of freshwater lagoons running inland, before the sea broke through and came tumbling along. Around Port Phillip Bay, people described crossing dry-footed from the eastern side to Geelong before the water rushed in through the heads. Near Cairns, Gunganigi informants said the Great Barrier Reef was the original coast. One account names a place halfway out to Fitzroy Island, now underwater, called after the trees that grew there. Now, the objections, because they are serious, and they belong here. Nunn and Reed say in the paper itself that it can never be proven that these traditions recall post-glacial sea level rise. The dating is partly circular. The age comes from matching the content of a story to a curve, so the number is an output of the assumption. Most of the stories were recorded by colonial ethnographers in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and most of the Aboriginal people who told them are unnamed. The conventional scholarly ceiling for oral transmission is 500 to 800 years. Peter Hiscock, then at the University of Sydney, called the paper fantastical when it appeared. There is also a control case, and it comes from Nunn's own group. Wolf Creek Crater in Western Australia has a tradition attached to its formation, and the crater predates human arrival in Australia by more than 100,000 years. A geologically accurate story can be a correct inference by people who understood what they were looking at, rather than a memory of watching it happen. What keeps the argument alive is the transmission mechanism, which is not what most people picture. It is not a tale passed casually down a line. In the kin structures Nunn and Reed describe, specific relatives are formally responsible for checking that a story is being told correctly, and that responsibility crosses generations by design. It works less like a game of telephone, and more like an audit. The story gets checked. It is maintained by living institutions in societies that have gone on changing, as all societies do, while keeping their law and their language and their knowledge working. 2 artifact scatters on the seabed. 21 places where a description and a depth agree. That is the physical record of a fifth of a continent. The country itself is on no chart anywhere. The people whose ancestors walked it are still here, and they can still tell you where the coast used to be. Number 1. The map of the drowned world. Kurt Lambeck and 4 colleagues at the Australian National University published a curve in 2014 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It was built by inverting about 1,000 sea level observations, spanning 35,000 years, all of them taken deliberately from places far away from the old ice sheets, where the signal is global rather than local. The curve says this: between 29 and 21,000 years ago, the ocean stood 134 meters below where it stands now. There were about 52 million cubic kilometers more ice sitting on land than exists today. The main melt ran from roughly 16,500 years ago to 8,200 years ago, at an average of 12 meters per 1,000 years. After that, the rate decayed, and by about 2,500 years ago, the ocean had effectively stopped moving. Averages hide the important part. In 1989, Richard Fairbanks drilled the coral reefs off Barbados and published the first continuous record of the deglaciation in nature. What it showed was that the rise was not steady. It came in bursts. The largest of them was pinned down in 2012 by Pierre Deschamps and colleagues, using cores drilled off Tahiti by an international ocean drilling expedition. Their result was a rise of somewhere between 12 and 22 meters, most probably 14 to 18, beginning no earlier than 14,650 years ago and finished before 14,310. Roughly 340 years, more than 40 millimeters a year. A meter of vertical sea level every 20 to 25 years, sustained for 14 human generations. Where the water came from is still argued. In 2021, Yucheng Lin at Durham and colleagues used sea-level fingerprinting across 6 sites and apportioned it. About 12 meters from North America, 4.5 from Scandinavia, and only about 1 from Antarctica. They found that Antarctic dominant scenarios are refused outright by isolation basin records in Scotland. That is not the last word. It is the current balance of evidence. It is worth understanding how the map itself gets made, because it is not a matter of subtracting 134 meters from a depth chart. It starts with a modern grid of the seabed and the land surface, with a sea level curve laid over it. Then the Earth has to be modeled as a body that deforms. Crust that was pressed down under kilometers of ice is still rising today. The bulges pushed up around the ice margins are still collapsing. The surface of the ocean itself is warped by the gravitational pull of the ice. Richard Peltier's model at Toronto, refined against GPS measurements of vertical ground motion and checked against satellite gravity data, produces a grid of past topography for each time slice. The coastline of any given moment in the past is simply the zero contour of that grid. Every map in this script traces back to that calculation. What makes this the largest event in the human past is the number that falls out of it. Around 20 million square kilometers of continental shelf were dry land during the last glacial period and are seabed now. Europe alone had about 2.5 million square kilometers more land than it does today, an increase of some 40% on its present size. That is not a coastal strip. That is a second Europe along every shore. And it was the good part. Flat, watered, full of estuaries and river mouths and shellfish beds, which is where human beings have always preferred to live. All of it was inhabited while our species was spreading across the planet. The routes out of Africa, the crossings into Australia, the movement into the Americas, the entire question of when people began living on the sea rather than beside it. The evidence for all of that sits on the shelf. Here is what has been recovered. Splash Coast, the European Research Network, chaired by Jeff Bailey at the University of York, brought together more than 100 researchers from over 60 institutions across 26 countries. It built a database of underwater find spots covering a span from about 1 million years ago to the establishment of the modern shoreline, and it holds close to 3,000 of them across 20 countries. 3,000 points on 20 million square kilometers. Bailey and Nicholas Fleming put the consequence into one sentence in 2008. Underwater investigation is essential if hypotheses of early human adaptation and dispersal are to be fully tested. There is one more turn in this, and it concerns the ground under your feet. The shoreline every map on Earth is drawn against is roughly 6,000 years old. It is not a permanent feature of the planet. It is where the water happened to stop when the ice ran out. And every port, every fishing town, and every coastal city on every continent was built afterwards on the far side of the event, on the beach the flood left behind. 2.15 billion people now live within 100 kilometers of that line and below 100 meters of elevation. Nearly 900 million of them live less than 10 meters above the tide. Our entire idea of what the world looks like is a snapshot of the aftermath. Every coast you have ever stood on is a line the water stopped at, and it stopped there for no reason except that the ice had run out. Somewhere off every shore on this planet, there is a landscape with rivers in it, and hills, and lake beds, and the places where people sat down and made things. One stretch of it in the North Sea has been mapped properly. Everywhere else, the best map anyone has is a contour line for a coast, with nothing drawn inside it. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.